Two specific things. Democracies all over the world are protected not in parliaments. In the last instance, democracies are defended by the public on the street. That all over the world, not just in India. One should never expect legislatures or judiciary, forget executive. Executive is also the problem. But judiciary is not, more often than not, judiciary is not part of the solution. It's part of the problem. And media certainly is part of the problem. In the last instance, republics are defended by the public out on the street. So the practice that I was talking about involves strengthening social movements. In our democracy, institutions have always been very fragile. This has been one of the designing problems of Indian democracy. Our institutions have always been fragile. But our movements have covered up for the weakness of our institutions. And those movements need to be strengthened. Strengthening of movement is one practice. And creating a new language, a language that draws upon things that people genuinely value. That's what connects me again to Father Kappen. And I was really intrigued by the quote that you read out. You know, while all of us, most of us sitting in this room, would deeply regret what's happening in the country today, would deeply be appalled by what the rulers of this country are up to, what we are unwilling to recognize is that we have handed over to them some of the deepest assets of this country, of this civilization. Three I would mention and stop. Nationalism, civilizational pride, cultural pride, and religion. These three things were our civilizational heritage. These were our weapons. These are things national movement drew upon. Gradually, the liberal progressive elite of this country started becoming embarrassed about nationalism. What we did was we vicariously started inheriting the embarrassment of European elite about European nationalism. And they have very good reasons to be embarrassed about their nationalism. But we don't. You know, why should I feel embarrassed about nationalism in the way in which Germans feel embarrassed about German nationalism? I have a positive nationalism to inherit. My nationalism connected me to South Africa, to Palestinians, it took me to Bandung. My nationalism never pitted me against my neighbor. Why should I hand over this legacy of nationalism to those who did not give 1 ounce of blood for this country's freedom? This is a criminal neglect on our part. 2, civilizational pride. Every civilization in the world, every community in this world likes to feel good about itself. And every community has reasons to feel good about themselves, which is not to say that your past did not contain evil and problems. What our national movement did was that it picked up the best from our past and it applied a filter to discard what was not acceptable in our past. What our liberal, educated, modern elite did was that they simply turned their back to our past, unlike our national movement. This is true in terms of language, the language that we speak. I mean, our liberal elite has almost no connect to the people of this country. If you cannot share someone's sense of cultural well-being, pride, then there's no way you can speak to that person. You cannot say to that person, why are you destroying this mosque? You would say, Acha, tum aaj mujhe batane aaye ho. You know, because we have no connect to them. And finally, religion. And I'm really honored to speak in the memory of Father Kappen here. Because I do believe unlike what our modern secular elite believed, that religions of this country have been our strength. Religions have carried and have justified a lot of oppression, as all religions do. It's like a river. A river brings you water. A river also brings you sand. It also brings you a lot of trash. You don't stop drinking water because the river actually also brought trash. You separate the trash, you let the sand settle, and then you drink the water. This is what we should have been doing to religion. We have been very serious, criminally negligent of our religious traditions. And in this house, I'm sure no one would misunderstand me. I'm speaking about traditions. We have Christianity in this country did not come with colonialism. But I bet 90% of non-Christian Indians do not know this. Everyone associates Christianity with colonialism. You know, my Christianity is older than Europe's Christianity. Why can't I draw from that? Islam came to my country as soon as it came to the rest of the world. You know, why should I take my lessons of Islam from some Arab country? There are deep traditions in all the religions of this country. Our national movement leaders were conscious of the fact that they needed to keep that connect. In post-independence India, we lost that connect. And as soon as we lost that connect, we lost our ability to speak to ordinary people. So, Re-Enchanting Democracy would be about recovering that language. That cannot be an instrumental thing. You cannot run down religion all your life and then write a pamphlet on Vivekananda and say how great Vivekananda was. It doesn't work, doesn't wash. No one believes you, no one takes you seriously. You know, we have to imbibe these things. We have to genuinely begin to respect this. All these are awkward ideas. I'm sure some of my friends may be upset about my saying these things. But we live in times when we should not bother about making our friends happy. We should bother about speaking the truth, which is like a refugee these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really masterful, the way you took us through the entire lecture. I don't know whether I should begin with being devil's advocate and asking the awkward questions, or should I begin with, maybe what I'll say is that what I really appreciated was this demolition of the idea of democracy, not the ideal of democracy, but the mechanism of democracy. And that's something I'll really take away from this. I'm sure there are others in the audience who will wish to respond to it. Let me just be devil's advocate and talk about the filters, since that's the last thing you did talk about, one of the last things. And I want to say that among the filters that were applied at the time of nationalism and the national movement, some of the filters also had to do with women and promoting a Victorian ideal of womanhood. The other had to do with language. This is a contentious one, and I do want to provoke it further because Lohia too has spoken about the single language, multi-language issue. And I know that largely the language issue, I've spoken to Theodore about this at length, is one that we feel must be reclaimed in order to strengthen ourselves. I'm playing devil's advocate. And I'm saying that in a family such as mine, where we broke with caste and community and language for 3 generations, what happens to our language? And English has given me the power to now speak and to be here at this podium. So what happens to pariahs such as us who speak this colonizer's language? And the third thing has to do with, I've had the longest battle with secular politics because I feel it's been stripped of spirituality or religion and hasn't been able to speak an enchanting language to the people. So I really appreciate that thought, but we can't throw caste out of that. So if you would just respond to those 3, the question of women, the question of caste, and the question of language.
You're not being devil's advocate. Actually, these are the most legitimate questions that such a argument must confront. Now, so I look at our national movement. I keep saying Indian Constitution was not framed in 2 years. It was framed in 100 years. It's 100 years of engagement with our past, looking at our future. And India's freedom struggle had crafted what I called a very desi modernity. It's very modern. Incidentally, Gandhi also is a very, very modern person in everything that he does. But it's very rooted. Modernity need not copy. Our modernity need not be a poor copy of European modernity. It's something about which our national movement was very conscious. The trouble is that with the coming of political independence, our cultural slavery became deeper than before. Till 1947, we were aware of the fact that we were colonized, we were subjects. The coming of political freedom gave me this false belief that culturally I am no longer a subject, while indeed in reality, we continue to be so. The national movement used 2 or 3 filters. The 2 biggest filters used by national movement, filters in the sense of we will receive things from our past, but these following things will straight away put in the dustbin. One was caste. And there has been a consensus. To be fair, even among the right-wing thinkers, there was a consensus about putting caste in the dustbin, if you forget some of their particularly lunatic expressions. But there has been a complete consensus about it may not have been articulated in the language in which Baba Saheb articulated it, but that caste system inequalities must go was part of our national movement consensus.
Lala Lajpat Rai, for example.
Yeah. Even sort of people who are seen as right-wing, as Lala Lajpat Rai, you get that in them. In no constitution of the world would you have something like prohibition of untouchability written in the constitution. It's not a law. It's written in the constitution. So that was one. Second is on the gender question. I would have liked it to be stronger than it is, but there is a clear filter, no discrimination based on gender. Those are things which are written into our constitution. And I'm so very happy that the constitution did that. The language question, I think, has been very poorly understood. Lohiya's own position has been poorly understood, but that doesn't matter. We shouldn't spend time on those things. The consensus of the national movement was not about Hindi. It's a very poor articulation of the consensus of the national movement was about Indian languages to be prioritized. India, and then most of our leaders of freedom struggle, almost all of them, with the exception of Nehru, I think, and partial exception of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, all of them understood and read English. All of them principally wrote and spoke in one of the Indian languages. That to me was the national movement consensus. The difficult question was, how do you translate that into the business of official languages? On which there was some contention in the Constituent Assembly. But once again, the consensus was, the 2 parts to this consensus. The stronger one was about privileging Indian languages. Somehow this question of which one of the Indian languages should get primacy became an issue of dispute in Constituent Assembly. If I were to look at it today, I would say, why do I need to ask this question? We really don't, this business of one official language is a question that got more attention than it deserved, created more controversy, and has been therefore an instrumental for continuing the hegemony of the English language. My problem with English is exactly what Ram Manohar Lohia said. Ram Manohar Lohia said, My problem with English is not that it is a foreign language. My problem is that it's a feudal language, that it's a language of inequality in this country. That's my only issue. After 75 years, I think English is one of the Indian languages. Especially if we are willing to if we stop mocking at, I am having 2 cows wali English jo hai. That is our Indian English. It's spoken, it's written. The only reason, you see, don't forget that Australian English and American English was mocked at till the early 20th century. Till the middle of the 20th century, before Marshall Plan, no one thought Americans knew how to speak English. Marshall Plan transformed it. Dollars came, power equations changed. Suddenly, American English became one acceptable, respectable variant of English. When would our elite start accepting Indian English as a respectable, legitimate variant of English? I'm having 2 cows is a perfect English. It's only an issue of power. It's only an issue of money. So someone said about dialect and language, what is the difference between a dialect and language? And someone said, a dialect that has an army and a state is a language. And
Lovely.
I think that's the issue. So Indian English is an Indian English. It's one of my languages. I'm perfectly fine with it. On Hindi, I think we need to think of that question carefully. I have repeatedly, incidentally said, the Hindi day should be abolished. It's been not a position I'm taking here in Bengaluru. I've written articles again and again to say Hindi day should be abolished. It should be converted into Indian Languages Day. Hindi is one of the youngest languages in this country. And the metaphor that I have always used is that there are so many sisters. Hindi happens to be the youngest sister. Sometimes young sister happens to have more money than others. In this case, this young sister has bigger footprint. And that bigger footprint is a result of many dialects being merged into Hindi.
The loss of multiple dialects.
Yeah, exactly. So in a sense, today what we call Hindi speaking area, if you take someone from Bhagalpur in Bihar and bring that person to my village, I can tell you they would not understand one word of what they are saying, but they would still be called Hindi speakers. So it's through that fudging that it has happened. Hindi can perform a very valuable function. But please remember that one of the most powerful proponents of Hindi were those who were not Hindi speakers. Gandhiji, Bhagat Singh, Baba Sahib. Hindi is useful as long as Hindi is not promoted by the state. Hindi is useful as long as you allow cricket and cinema to do its job. These are the best ambassadors for Hindi. And as long as Hindi allows itself to be expressed in 25 forms. The Hindi spoken in Hyderabad is a perfect Hindustani. The Hindi being spoken on the streets in Bengaluru in Shivaji Nagar is a perfect Hindi. The trouble is with the Hindi, with a certain kind of chauvinism that has entered and of which you get a taste in the Constituent Assembly. When Hindi speakers begin to think that they are the landlords and everyone else is a tenant, this mentality is what needs to be broken. But I would not allow this, I would not like to allow this tension to therefore make way for the dominance of English that continues in our country. I continue to believe that if language had a color and if language had some way of imprinting itself on your skin, then India of today would look like an apartheid country. We live in apartheid. It's a linguistic apartheid that we don't recognize.
Thank you. I'll have to mull on that. It's going to take a while, yeah. The other thing I wanted to say was it must have occurred to a lot, but when you spoke about, while you, in your demolition of this mechanism of democracy, you also mentioned that democracy was the way we know it now, the way we understand it as a recent phenomenon. Because for the Greeks, democracy only meant democracy among the patricians. There was no democracy for all the people. It was democracy among those who had land, is what we're talking about, no? That there is no level playing field, really, as long as we have this kind of economic disparity, lack of access to resources, lack of access to information. There is no playing field. So the sort of idealized democracy that we're taught about in the NCRT books, in our civics books, has to be dismantled.
I completely agree. I think what Baba Saheb said in the Constituent Assembly about one vote, that we have political equality in a system where there's deep social and economic inequality, that continues to be the most apt characterization of the so-called democracy that we have in a capitalist economy, patriarchal society, and a caste order. Within these three, democracy is always a very seriously circumscribed affair. And we need to underline it. We need to remind ourselves and everyone about this. And the ideal of democracy, therefore, would require dismantling of all these three.
My last question, and then I'm opening it out to the audience, has to do with you mentioned 3 or 4 times, you mentioned non-human creatures or animals in nature. For me, that is extremely rich because it also connects with Vista's commitment to eco-justice and to joining the dots between the ways in which people live, the land on which they live, the food they eat, the food they grow, the food they eat, and subsequently their social mechanisms and political mechanisms. Could you speak further about that and why you mentioned it so many times?
I mean, one of the, suppose elephants had a community. Elephants come together, they find a system of voting, and they decide that the city called Bengaluru is a bit of a problem. It comes in the way when we have to go from the Western Ghats to this way. Let's demolish it. Do they have the right to do so? We would be appalled. We would laugh at this idea. Are we not doing exactly the same? On this earth, there are so many creatures, one of which, us, happen to have this thing. We have come together. We have colluded in this lovely thing that we call democracy, looked at from the eyes of the great Indian bustard, would look like a conspiracy. These fellows have come together. They have decided amongst themselves that I should be finished. Who are you to decide that? So there's a deep moral question. And moral question also about future generations. Who are we to decide whether children born tomorrow would have decent air or not? We are deciding that. As I said, people in my village have drunk the water for the next 7 generations. I mean, what gives us the moral right to do so? That's one part of it. And secondly, even if you put the morality aside, suppose we were not to care for nature, we were not to care for any other species. This is a pure act of suicide that we are committing, And I honestly do not see normal mechanisms of democracy with the most perfect election taking place in the most level playing ground. Remember, it's level for me and you, not for elephants. So in the most level playing ground, I cannot imagine it would produce just outcomes which would not lead to collective suicide by human beings. And we have to have provisions that prevent us from committing collective suicide or prevent us from killing those who are not born yet. We have to have safeguards. Otherwise, democratic mechanism will never yield you this.
Stay ahead with our cutting-edge news app. Instantly access the latest shorts in just 1 minute and breaking news in just 50 words. Download now for a smarter, faster news experience.